Hi, y'all. I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person. Um, uh, One of these days, maybe, but in the meantime, I want to thank ASI for inviting me, and especially for give thanks to Jane and Kim and Gayla, who have been so welcoming, and whose own work has, each of your work has also greatly touched and influenced mine, and I want to thank you for that. And with that, I'll get right into my paper, which is called Creaturely Remains and the Mattering of Memory. The terms creature and creaturely have become popular in the field of animal studies. On one level, these terms remind us of the theological context of creation, in which we are all God's creatures and share in our role as created beings rather than creators. This association of the creaturely with a kind of passivity is also at play in recent post-secular uses of the term that call attention to the shared embodiment of humans and other animals. Anat Pick calls for a poetics that attends to the beauty of the flesh and of our shared vulnerability as mortal beings over and above the power of mind. Eric Santner has focused especially on the biopolitical dimension of passivity as what he calls an exposure to the excitations of power, one that, however, he sees as peculiar to human life. Thus, he speaks of the essential disruption that renders man creaturely. Creaturely in this regard is life shed of historical agency and abandoned to the mute thingness of nature, the human fallen to the state of an animal. But is the creaturely necessarily mute? Or is it rather that creaturely matter speaks in ways we have yet to listen to or understand? Insofar as the creaturely is produced by forces of exposure, might it also bear witness to those forces? In what follows, I want to pursue a line of thinking that links a creaturely memory to issues of traumatic memory in order to question the ways that bodies, both living and dead, hold on to or respond to elements of the past, ways that resist being spoken or written, or perhaps that the mind is simply unable to retrieve. Memory, of course, has always had a fraught relation to the writing of history because of its unreliability. On the one hand, the idea of a creaturely memory comes close to what Pierre Nora has called true memory, that lives in gestures, habits, and unspoken traditions, and that he distinguishes from the kinds of cultural memory that is stored in archives. On the other hand, insofar as memory is not only what we can recall, but also what we are subjected to, it is also a kind of wounding, a reminder of the physical vulnerability we share with other creatures and oftentimes inflict upon them. For critics like Walter Benjamin, attention to the wounding of other animals lay behind his rejection of humanism, as it also steered him towards what Beatrice Hansen describes as a new ethical modality, one that consists in an extreme attentiveness characterized by a radical openness to the creaturely. This openness to the creaturely is especially apparent in Benjamin's writings on Kafka, where, moreover, he claims that animals are receptacles of the forgotten. And he adds that Kafka did not tire from picking up the forgotten from animals. What then might it mean to pick up the forgotten from animals, and how might we do so? To be sure, as I have written elsewhere, Kafka associates the forgotten with a kind of wounding, and also with a superficial manner of healing. That healing is essentially a forgetting, both of the moment and the cause of the wound, and of what life was like before the wounding. This is the situation of Red Peter in a report to an academy, whose scars are the only traces he has left of his former life as an ape, a life he is otherwise unable to remember or speak about. Red Peter is not that beast whom Nietzsche describes as living unhistorically in the present moment. He is rather the humanized beast, who has had to forget in order to find a way out of his subjection. Forgetting is, Nietzsche states, the property of all action. The forgotten is thus also endemic to our history. Might an openness to the creaturely help us retrieve what was forgotten and so lost to history? It is with these questions in mind that I turn to the work of the Belgian artist Berlinda de Broekere and to her 2016 installation in the Hauser and Wirth Gallery in New York, which I want to suggest reveals the affective power of creaturely remains. By this, I mean their power to point towards the very forces that shape them, historically as well as artistically. In the wide gallery spaces, we are confronted by a series of life-size horse and hide sculptures made with wood, wax, iron, fabric, and horse skins. Entitled No Life Lost, the installation was meant to be a tribute to those horses whose lives were lost during the First World War, whether in battle or in the transport of men and artillery. The show was also an effort to come to grips with de Broekere's own childhood memories of horse slaughter. For her father was a butcher, and while horses in Belgium, as elsewhere in Europe, were often looked upon as noble animals, they were also eaten. One area of the gallery, and I'm going to share my screen and hopefully there we go. So in one area of the gallery, thus took on the image and scale of the refrigerator rooms of slaughterhouse houses filled with a series of disembodied skins, here cast in wax, splayed and hung on hooks, a visual reminder of the size and color of each animal. Of each animal who was to be eaten. Having once visited a skin trader's workshop in Anderlecht, Belgium, de Broekere remarked that I was unable to avert my eyes. I knew I had witnessed something I needed to transcribe. Never have I experienced death and life as intensely as I did there. That simultaneity of life and death is what the viewer experiences before the display of waxed skins, mementos of living and breathing horses, but also remnants of creatureliness in Santner's terms, as the result of exposure to systems of power, in this case, those of the food and agricultural industries. As one of de Broekere's reviewers wrote, they are works born of bloodied memory, hers in particular, and ours by implication. History and memory thus join roles in the Hauser and Wirth exhibition as they do within the larger tradition of taxidermy as an art of the trophy, a commemoration of animal killing and collection. But de Broekere's taxidermy is of another sort. The arrangement, taxis, of skins, derma, meant to expose rather than participate in the anthropocentric practices of trophy hunting. Writing about taxidermy's place within natural history museums in the 19th century, Donna Haraway describes its particular contributions to patriarchal and colonial missions that sought not only to take control of animals from exotic or faraway places, but to create visual narratives of that possession to display for posterity. Taxidermy, she writes, was made into the servant of the real. It was the craft of remembering this perfect experience. Realism was a supreme achievement of the art of memory, a rhetorical achievement crucial to the foundations of Western science, she writes. That was in part because taxidermy came into popularity at the same time as nature and the animals within it were receding from view due to increasing urbanization and industrialization. A crucial part of the story, however, was of killing the animal itself, which had to be accomplished as a sportsman's-like act, The animal, in other words, had to be a worthy foe, a perfect specimen of an idealized or perhaps exoticized nature, conquered and brought back into view only by the superior capacities of man. More recently, taxidermy has become of renewed interest, not so much for its participation in the subjugation and realist representation of nature, but rather for the ways in which its use destabilizes our relations to animals and to art. Rachel Poliquin writes of the irresolvable tension between the once alive animal that taxidermy recalls and the lifeless object it has become. Animal or object, animal and object, she asks. We are not allowed to choose. Giovanni Aloy has coined the label speculative taxidermy for recent practices that are concerned with the materiality and manipulation of animal skins, but also with the biopolitical registers inscribed in such operations. Contrasting speculative taxidermy with the botched taxidermy theorized by Steve Baker, in which the animal, if recognized as such, was a passive and speechless victim, Aloy focuses on the productive potential of this new practice, in which the skins are anything but dumb. What they speak about, furthermore, is generated through a host of material discursive forces that question the boundaries between human and non-human and reveal their entangled histories. And as Jane Desmond has also written, the actual corporeal presence of the animal in works of taxidermy are able to activate our own bodily affect because there is still a link to a once living being, a horse. Crucial for such taxidermied art is that animals are not killed in or for the art. Rather, the skins are taken from animals who have died by other causes. Its practitioners are often women, and as with de Bruckeret, the animals represented are often domestic animals, those who are unworthy objects for traditional taxidermy. The very issue of domestication, furthermore, brings to the fore connections between histories of gender, class, and species, often rendered in recognizable stance of submission, if not shame. As we shall see in more detail below, such stances establish a very different relation between viewer and animal than those seen in taxidermy's traditional celebration of conquest. De Bruckeret pushes to an even further extent the confusion between animal and object that Poliquin articulates in order to ensure a certain illegibility in the animal, it, him, herself, and an uncertainty about who or what this animal is, or how specifically a horse came to be in this position. The confusion extends even to the affective response, which can shift from sympathy or sadness to disgust. Horses have been a focus of much of my work over the years, partly because they were once so central to our own lives, but also because of the ways they continue to raise social, political, and ethical concerns regarding our lived relations to other animals and to our own animality or creatureliness. This is especially true of de Bruckeret's horses, who display none of the majestic or noble stances traditionally associated with the animal that the 18th century French naturalist, the Comte du Buffon, described as the most beautiful conquest of man. One of the especially moving, this is quotes from Haraway I forgot to put up. One of the especially moving pieces is a case containing two life-size horses lying one atop the other as if packed for transport, whether to war or to the butcher. There is a sad tenderness in the way the bodies touched each other, as if each was protection for the other against the other's creatureliness, against their exposure to power, in Santner's terms. But the creaturely in de Bruckeret's works also reminds us of what Beatrice Hansen saw as Benjamin's efforts to reinscribe the theological into the seemingly abject realm of the creaturely. Thus, one of the sculptures figures the horse as sacrificial lamb its legs and life force bound in martyrdom, even as here, once again, its eyes are bandaged, as if to prevent it from seeing or acknowledging its exposure, all the while accentuating the spectator's role as witness, if not also our need for redemption, a need thought to be satisfied through animal sacrifice. I was reminded of the ending of J.M. Coetzee's novel Disgrace, when the main protagonist, David Lurie, gives up the one dog he has been caring for, the one who he knows would die for him. Quote, bearing him in his arms like a lamb, unquote, he determines his time has come and offers him up to be euthanized with the others who have been abandoned for being too many or too much. What, I began to wonder, is given up, if not forgotten, when we give up the animal? I did not know at the time I saw the exhibit that de Broekere had been collaborating with Coetzee for some years. At her request, he helped curate her show at the 2013 Venice Biennale, and the two have co-authored a number of books. One in particular will be a focus for me here. Its title, We Are All Flesh, seems to defy the statement made by another of Coetzee's protagonists, Elizabeth Costello, who distinguishes human from animal by claiming that the animal's whole being is in the living flesh. We Are All Flesh, by contrast, is inclusive of human and non-humans alike, and suggests furthermore that we humans might have something to learn from the life worlds we share with non-humans. Memory is a key theme in We Are All Flesh. The book is composed of selected passages quoted from Coetzee's many novels, interspersed with images from de Broekere's many installations. As the book jacket explains, the point was not for Coetzee to write about the objects, but rather to add to them by juxtaposing the work with creative text. The resonance between visual image and writing is powerful, not because of any descriptive or explanatory function, but rather because of the unexpected questions each raises to the other. The first two images in the book were taken from Broekere's The Wound of 2012 and Lingam of 2013, and which focus on what look like scars created and exacerbated by stitching over of wounds whose flesh lies lumpy and reddened beneath. The first few quotations from Coetzee also reference the scars of suffering, which we, referring probably to we humans, though I'm not really sure, carry with us. With these scars, he writes, one develops a hard skin against one's honesty. The fourth excerpt is taken from Disgrace. It references the rape that Lucy, daughter of the main protagonist, suffers in her own home, while her father lies helpless and beaten in a bathroom nearby. So time does heal all. Presumably Lucy is healing too, or if not healing, then forgetting, growing scar tissue around the memory of that day, sheathing it, sealing it off, so that one day she may be able to say, the day we were robbed, and think of it merely as the day they were robbed. Healing here implies a forgetting. It is a stitching or writing over of past events, effected in order to remember only those parts of the past with which one can more comfortably live. Memory thus becomes history by allowing essential unknowable moments to slip to the wayside or to unconscious oblivion, suggesting that history too, perhaps like Nietzsche said of life, is impossible without forgetting. Whereas We Are All Flesh opens with images of human scarring, towards the end of the book, we find, somewhat surprisingly, images of the glossy taxidermied coat of a horse shot from angles that render the equine's curled or folded body at once glossy or tortured. On the one hand, we might wonder if this luminous fur is another kind of writing, one meant to cover over the wounding involved in taxidermy's history. What else then might be the relation of this fur to the matter of scarring? Do horses not heal in the same way? Might this be one reason that Benjamin describes animals as receptacles of the forgotten? suggesting that they, unlike Lucy, are unable to write over the past, which remains stored within their bodies? If so, can those forgotten elements be retrieved or picked up? Indeed, it was Kafka's attentiveness towards all living creatures, which Benjamin, citing Malebranche, praised as the natural prayer of the soul. The work of Nicolas Malebranche, a late 17th century theological philosopher, may have particular relevance for our thinking about creaturely memory. Malebranche broke from the Cartesian tradition to suggest that an ideal intelligibility can be had through sentient experience and not, as Descartes would have it, through the mind or language. In an essay on Malebranche and Merleau-Ponty, Judith Butler writes that what one finds in the work of both philosophers is an insistence on the centrality of the body to the act of knowing. The knowledge disclosed through the body, however, is difficult to bring to light, Butler explains, because of the temporal delay between sensing and knowing, and because of the incommensurability between sensing and speech. Quote, bodily significations do not become successfully converted or sublimated into speech, even as the two modalities remain related to one another, even if in symptomatic ways. In a similar vein, de Brucqueret's sculptures and Coetzee's writings are symptomatically related, but their symptoms are not always translatable or even intelligible. Coetzee writes about de Brucqueret saying, I have been touched by her work in ways that are often obscure to me. I would not wish it otherwise. Touch, as I shall consider below, speaks, but is not always intelligible. What I want to consider then is how this idea of a knowing animal body who is incommensurate with the I who speaks may have relevance for memory or trauma studies and for animal studies. Certain bodily and traumatic experiences, like that which Lucy undergoes in disgrace, may never be fully recoverable in speaking or writing. And this may be because our language and writing are always somewhat out of touch with the body. According to Butler, touch for Malebranche and Merleau-Ponty is the animating principle of feeling and knowing. It is prior to, but also the very condition for saying I, or at least that is the case for any I that feels and has a bodily experience. Insofar as that feeling begins with a touch that is not mine, it can also threaten me in the very boundaries I imagine for myself. Indeed, it is not uncommon to lose trust in touch, as does the young protagonist of Mary Gatesfield's novel, The Mare, evidenced by the way she begins to shield herself from physical contact with humans who have abused her physically and verbally. She had lost her trust in touch. Part of the healing character for this character, whose name significantly is Velvet, is to find herself drawn to bodily contact with horses, those creatures, as the trainer and philosopher Vicky Hearn describes, whose, quote, intelligence we can just barely have any understanding of, partly because we communicate with horses through touch. Every muscle twitch of the rider will be like a loud symphony to a horse, unquote. The point is to make oneself legible to the horse by coming to an understanding that can only happen through the skin, not through words. Horses, we learn, speak by other means if we are willing and able to listen and hear. The incommensurability of language and touch has important implications, not only for human-animal relations, but also for human-human relations. Questioning our relation to our own sensation, Butler asks, under what conditions does the I become capable of reporting on what it feels? The question has ethical implications when we consider the ways in which we begin to read and the imprint and reception of touch on and by another, human or animal. How and where does the animal body speak? This bodily expression has become the focus of recent writings about trauma and healing, and about the insufficiency of talk therapy to fully heal the body, even as it may offer the balm of a better story about the past. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk writes of that extraordinary capacity of the mind to rewrite memory, but he also warns that the rewriting may not reach the actual deeper memory which lives in the body, such as we saw with Lucy's scars referenced above. Perhaps the most important finding in our study was that remembering the trauma with all its associated affects does not, as Breuer and Freud claimed back in 1893, necessarily resolve it. Our research did not support the idea that language can substitute for action, writes van der Kolk in his 2014 book, The Body Keeps Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. Rather than Freud and Breuer, van der Kolk looks to Pierre Janet, Charcot's co-researcher at the Salpêtrière in Paris. It was Janet who pointed to the difference between narrative memory, or the stories people tell about trauma, and traumatic memory itself. Remembering, he asserts, cannot resolve trauma because the traumatic memories are not organized as coherent, logical narratives, but in fragmented sensory and emotional traces, images, sounds, and physical sensations. Traumatic memories, that is to say, are stored in the body, expressed physically, and so it is the body that must also be healed. Perhaps it is so that all languages are finally foreign languages, alien to our animal being, writes Coetzee. In what might be an illustration of this point, he or his narrator comments upon how we speak of the dog with the sore foot, or the bird with the broken wing, but the dog does not think of itself in those terms, or the bird. To the dog, when it tries to walk, there is simply, I am pain. To the bird, when it launches itself into flight, simply, I cannot. Animals are their body or their flesh, which does not imply they have no consciousness or subjectivity, but rather affirms that the relationship between subjectivity and bodily being for them is not one of separation or ownership as of property, but a kind of cathexis. Coetzee writes that language cannot get going until it has split up the unity of experience. Healing then must work by reestablishing the unity of body and consciousness that our language, our autobiographical stories have split. In this regard, we might see de Broqueret's horses as saying, I am flesh, I am, we are pain, I am shame, I am fur, as taxidermied hides are presented in various poses of sacrifice or slaughter, with faces bandaged, legs tied, and bodies generally and variously incapacitated, if not skinned, in preparation for eating. Their presence and present tense express an embodied past and continuity with the past trauma. Coetzee has written elsewhere that her sculptures, quote, explore life and death, death in life, life in death, life before death, death before death, in the most intimate and disturbing way. They bring illumination, but the illumination is as dark as it is profound. Such dark illumination is intimately related to the contradictory power of the fur that was part of the attraction for the artist when the horses were still alive and was taken only after their death. Darkness and illumination, death and life gleam in this fur, which perhaps warns us of the aesthetic exploitation of animal bodies that might join the theological and industrial. In his book on surface encounters, Ron Broglio asks, how might we think from the fur of the beast? And asks whether such a surface thinking might work to invert the hierarchies of surface and depth with which we have judged animal and human worlds. It is curious how many of the images in We Are All Flesh show us fur separated from the bodies that we might expect it merely to cover or belong to, as if for de Broqueret, the fur were a world of its own. Soft and glossy with luminous depth, swirls of luminous depth, it invites touch and tempts us to get lost in its feel. Lost being this title of a separate 2004 installation from whose sculptures the shots of fur were taken. Thus, The image from the book entitled The Black Horse shows a close-up of a glossy, gleaming coat on a body whose form we cannot quite read. Perhaps a horse in the process of lying down or standing up. Reattached to their sculptural bodies, the fur becomes again the surface of a body that reads now as distorted, bent over, or hunched, as if referencing the hunchback that, according to Benjamin, will disappear with the coming of the Messiah. This is a figure of shame, and as such illustrates in a way that the fur alone does not, the following passage from Kitseya's Age of Iron that is nevertheless juxtaposed to. Perhaps I should accept that it is how one must accept to live from now on, in a state of shame. Perhaps shame is nothing more than the name for the way I feel all the time, the name for the way in which people live who would prefer to be dead. Kitseya's narrator thus joins de Broekere's horse in an experience of the creaturely, not as a fallen state peculiar to humans as Santner would have it, but rather as one shared by humans and non-humans alike. The pose of this horse recalls that of William Wegman's dog in his photo entitled Bikini. Reading this image as a figure of shame, Alice Kusniar explains that the word comes from the Indo-European word skam or skem, meaning hide or skin. Shame is the result of the manner in which we turn fur to flesh by skinning an animal or dressing it in clothes, such that the nude becomes, in the terms of classical aesthetics, naked and wanting. Excuse me. But shame is also, Kusniar reminds us, an interpersonal, if not the most interpersonal of affects. In a tradition reaching back to Sartre and before, shame is dependent upon the regard of the other. I see myself as others see me. Shame is thus another manifestation of the ocular centrism of Western philosophy and of human relations more generally. Perhaps this is one reason Darwin cites shame as the most human of emotions, one which animals show little signs of. Animals show no need to conceal their sex nor their excrement. And this, according to Freud, is the reason that the dog has earned contempt among humans and become a term of abuse. Might the images of fur exposed not as covering for a body, not as separable from it, but as an essential component of the body, also offer a different pathway towards making the body intelligible? This way would depend not on vision, not on form, but on feel and touch, if not also on smell, a sense of which humans are notoriously impoverished. If the dog or horse palpably embodies its creatureliness, the way to that creature must be through the body and by touch. And touch may also be the means to get to a creaturely memory that precedes or has not been clothed in writing. It is the instrument of what Desmond refers to as translational phenomenology. In an essay on the fecundity of the caress, Luce Irigaray asks, is the memory of touching always disguised by senses that forget where they come from? Creating distance through a mastery that constitutes the object as a monument built in place of the subject's disappearance? Mastery through distance is an all too common way of reacting to disgust and to the fear of vulnerability that, as Walter Benjamin suggests in a short reflection on gloves, is affected through touch. Quote, all disgust begins with disgust in touching. Touching that risks revealing our kinship with animals, a kinship, a contact, a touch that impels man to make himself its master. Such mastery, Kitseya suggests in a passage from his own autobiographical work, Boyhood, may, however, be a refusal of life. Nothing can touch you. There is nothing you are not capable of. And there we are. Those are the two things about him, two things that are really one thing, the thing that is right about him, that is wrong about him at the same time. This thing that is two things means that he will not die no matter what. But does it not also mean he will not live? To distance oneself from touch is thus to avoid recognition of our vulnerability, of our essential relatedness to others, human and non-human. It is to deny our creatureliness. And this may be why the memory of touching, the memory of the flesh is, Irigaray the most insistent and the most difficult to enter into memory. Memory of the flesh, where that which has not yet been written is inscribed, laid down, that which has no discourse to wrap itself in, that which has not yet been born into language, that which as a place has taken place, but no language, the felt which expresses itself for the first time, declares itself to the other in silence. Like the flesh, but without its associations with nakedness or shame, the fur is also a site of what has place or has taken place, but has not yet been inscribed in language. De Bruckeray's fur expresses an invitation to touch and thereby to remember or to reach a past event that might otherwise be forgotten or written over. The point here is not that animals do not know shame, or that it is only through a Nietzschean animal forgetting that the creature heals, whether from shame or other traumas. If, however, we understand a creaturely memory to be stored and exposed otherwise in and on the body, then it may be through such contact zones of flesh and fur that we can begin to find alternative methods for working through shame and the experience of vulnerability that gives rise to it. This is not a new idea, of course, and is one reason why animal therapy programs have often been successful, even if they do not always consider the effects on the animals. In my work on horses in 19th century France, I examine how theories of training horses figured as a means for reworking bodily memory and bodily responses to memories, whether equine or human. If the body keeps score, as Van der Kolk says, it is the body which needs to find new ways of responding to stimuli and to situations that in the past left it vulnerable. Touch is that place where being acted on and acting are simultaneous, the place where vulnerability can turn to agency and vice versa. And yet, as Hearn insists, touch is a kind of intelligence of which we have little understanding. That is why we must learn to read a horse's skin and become in turn kinesthetically legible to the horse. We depend upon the visual for intelligibility. Horses cannot be read simply by the visual without knowing them kinesthetically. We must learn to read the fur, learn how to make the tactile or the haptic intelligible. This is one aim of a haptic visuality, whose urgency takes us from embodied visual criticism to creaturely relations. To the extent that de Bruckeray and taxidermy more generally play with reactions to flesh and fur, it reminds us that one does not fully live in the world or have a world without touch. Signs in galleries saying, please do not touch the artworks, please do not touch the artworks, make our yearning for a tactile experience all the more apparent in its interdiction. If, as Butler writes, I can come to touch and feel and sense the world, it is only because this I before it could be called an I, was handled and sensed. To be sure, touch makes one vulnerable to the adverse recognition of the other. I may be drawn to stroke or scratch the fur of horses, dogs, cats, knowing that my touch may provoke a bite, a kick, or a scratch. But it might also be a first step towards a new reaction, a new ground for two creatures to become together. How can we reestablish trust in touch? This seems to me to be the question that Coetzee and de Bruckeray raise in their very different but mutually infective languages. To be sure, Certain words can also touch and move affectively, as Elizabeth Costello herself emphasizes when she describes herself as an animal in exhibiting, yet not exhibiting, to a gathering of scholars, a wound which I cover up under my clothes, but which touch on every word I speak. To expose the wound is to be vulnerable, to expose the creaturely being. The point is not to forget, to excise or stitch over the past, not to dissociate the self, nor to master the other, but rather to accept our shared animal fragility as a meeting place for new beginnings and becomings. It is to give ourselves over to the worlds enveloped by the fur in order to relearn how to feel and so turn disgust into wonder instead of mastery. No small order, I know. And I leave you with the final image from We Are All Flesh. Thank you very much. And I look forward to our discussion.